Today on Rebuilders, we look at the vibe shift after the vibe shift.
We are talking elections, Australian election, Canadian election, Singaporean election, UK local elections, German chancellery, Romanian elections, the role Trump's playing in it all, the disruption coming from India, Pakistan. But where it's all pointing towards is the vibe shift after the vibe shift is possibly volatility. Constant volatility. The audience, I can hear groaning. We've had too much. But how do we actually live faithfully in the midst of this? And what's the countercultural way of hope in the midst of volatility?
It's a great one. Let's get into it. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you guys?
Great. And gladdest of tidings to you both and to our listeners.
Oh, thank you, Charles
so
Dickens.
Very good. Very good. What's been happening around here?
Well, yeah, Daniel rang me for the weekly excitement at a local level.
Yeah.
For an office kind of church space in a sleepy suburb of Melbourne, there's a fair bit of activity that happens around here.
I think maybe we just ham it up a little bit.
Yeah. Well, we are the centre. So I was taking my boys to play soccer on Saturday morning and I got a call from Daniel, which was basically a call that a geyser of water, and I'm calling it a geyser, probably
It was a bit like a geyser.
4 or 5 meters high of water was shooting out from the front lawn. And a couple of the crew had come to pray or something like that and noticed this, and Daniel was asking if I was around. And so we had federal election, which we will talk about, and across from our office is a polling booth. And we can now say, because we've seen the footage, our security footage, that someone just decided to drive just up off the road onto the nature strip, as we call it in Australia, or you might call it a sidewalk or pavement or whatever in other countries, and hit the water main thing or water meter. And it just shot up in the air. And I came to vote. That was at 7:50. So this is my local polling booth. I came to vote at 11 a.m.-ish, and it was still there. There was kids playing in it. It became a natural water feature. And it was the talk of the polling booth. Yeah.
It's it's interesting looking at the footage. Because you have to go out of your way to run. This isn't like oops, I hit that. You have to kind of drive out of your. And I don't think it was malicious.
No,
I think it was an accident. But there's a big rock in front of the mains to prevent people from doing this. And they've hit the rock, run over the rock.
Oh, so there was a rock there previous.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's been a rock, and then the water main meter thing is behind it. So they've gone over the rock, hit the water meter, full on water going everywhere. But I think because it was election day, usual services were busier than normal, and so it took a while to get fixed. But it is fixed, and we have water back at the offices.
Well, in contrast to Daniel and Liddy, I believe this was a malicious attack upon Rebuilders itself. So strap yourselves in. This is a 3-hour deep dive into my theories behind this. No, well, we actually initially saw the first video, and you and I, Liddy, were looking at going, because we were sending around this to each other on text on Saturday morning. We were sort of looking at, it looks a bit, surely they can't just drive up. But then we saw from another angle, which you pulled up, the first part of our staff meeting yesterday was us all watching on this big screen, trying to work out what happened. And then they just parked and got some chairs out and had a little wander across to the...
Check that their car is okay.
Yeah, check their car is okay. It's just this thing shot up in the air. But so not a malicious attack.
It did, I will say, at that meeting yesterday, it did feel a little bit like what? And it would have been going on at FBI when the JFK assassination.
Yeah, the grassy knoll. Exactly.
Just looking at all the footage and from all the angles.
Was there a second car ramming
we have exciting times here.
Yeah. Indeed.
Yeah. If it's not foxes, it's water geysers.
Geysers, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot of people around. Like, yeah. So when I rocked up to vote, in Australia, you have how to vote cards. They're all handing you their little flyers to vote for their candidate. And they were all talking about like, oh, don't worry, people have been called, blah, blah, blah. I didn't say I was the local pastor. I'm going to confess now.
Ah, you didn't tell them.
No.
Because what would have you done though, Mark, if you
Well, I was afraid that they would expect me to lay across it. Sacrificially,
Stem the flow.
stemming the flow for the next 3 hours.
Well, that's not when spiritual revival breaks out like a geyser.
Yeah. The living waters will.
We don't want anyone just laying on top of it.
No, we'll stand back.
No.
Observe.
Watch
steward.
the water feature.
Well, it's an eschatological promise that, water will flow from the temple at the end of the age.
Yep. Yeah, it is. It's a good leap.
Yeah, great leap. Great. All right.
Here we are.
Enough of that.
Yes. Well, so you were in line to vote on Saturday morning. We had the Australian election on Saturday here, but there have been a number of elections happening across the world over the last couple of weeks. And today we're really talking about things under the umbrella of the vibe shift after the vibe shift.
Yeah. Well, there was particularly with the election of Donald Trump, second election of Donald Trump, there was a sense of this vibe shift in the world. And many people sort of were trying to sort of price in what would the future look like. And, is this significant turn to the right around the world? We did an episode on, the year that woke broke. That was the sort of sense. And it was interesting, where things earlier in the year stood, not just with Australia. I'm going to compare Canada and Australia a little bit here because it was a really interesting similar story. Earlier on, you had, Pierre Poilievre, who was the sort of conservative candidate in the Canadian election, who was up against Justin Trudeau, looking like, the strong favourite to win the election in Canada. You had Trudeau drop out and Mark Carney, former banker, head of the Bank of England, I think he was the head of the Bank of Canada as well, come in. And then that was the election last week. I think it was last week. When was it? Yeah, I'm losing track of time. But long story short, the result was, this massive turnaround you see. So if you see like on Polymarket, they have like this predictive betting on elections. And then with Donald Trump and particularly the 51st state comments, this massive turnaround where all of a sudden the Liberal Party won in Canada and Mark Carney was elected Prime Minister. But not only that, in the Westminster system, opposition leaders and even Prime Ministers can lose their seats. And Pierre Poilievre, who was, sort of seen almost as this sort of, inevitable conservative leader, he'd sort of pushed into elements of sort of the Trumpish moment in the world, but had his own sort of take on it, very pushed into housing, stuff like that. It had gone sort of quite viral. His, famous viral video of him, chewing on an apple, and was seen by many in right-wing parties around the world as sort of a model to follow of how to sort of jump on this bandwagon.
Yes.
Lost his own seat, which was quite sort of stunning. And so, and there's other stories in that, there's some tactical voting. Interestingly, in Canada, different to the Australian election, which we'll get into, a lot of young people voted for Poilievre. And it was sort of almost older boomers who got so in some ways the Canadian election looking a lot like some European elections where younger people are sort of going to the parties on the right. But just a complete turnaround and showing the Trump effect. So a week or so after that, we had the Australian election on Saturday. Australia is different to many countries in the world. They have compulsory voting.
Yep.
And what that does is you don't have to get people out to vote. You have to vote. And so everyone in Australia votes and who's on the electoral roll. And what that means is parties have got to sort of tack to the centre. But, again, go a few months back, around the start of the year, you had the Labor Party, which is our sort of centre-left party in power. You have the Liberals. Confusingly, the leftish party in Canada is called the Liberals. In Australia, it's called the Liberal Party, our Conservative Party, and sort of classical Liberal. And, it was thought that Labor would not do well or there was even some talk of them possibly losing because of cost of living crisis and so on, and a number of sort of different things that they tried to get through, which they hadn't gotten through. But what ended up happening was, again, since the Trump effect, particularly tariffs in Australia, this massive reversal. So just as the poly market sort of chart in Canada sees this huge shift where the Conservatives seem to be ahead, and then it completely turns around and, Carney wins. Very similar thing in Australia. But not only in Australia, it was even more profound, where really you just saw a landslide to the Labor Party. And really the Australian election was a huge sort of vote towards centrism. Yes. There's a lot of local stuff and so on. I'm not going to go into everything because we've got a very international podcast, people from all over the world listening. So we're just sort of doing the big ticket items. But, you saw that you've seen a number of the sort of Greens seats, which people thought were going to do really well, sort of on the further of the left to the left, looks like the leader of the Greens has lost his seat. But also, interestingly, the leader of the Conservative Party in Australia, Peter Dutton, like Pierre Poilievre, lost his seat in Canada. The exact same thing happened in Australia, and the leader of the Conservative Party lost his seat. So what that means for non-Westminster system people out there is, like they're out of politics, So it's like losing the match and getting a red card, And so, it was a stunning, huge win really for the Labor, and really in many ways, the Conservative movement in Australia is, could see a decade out of power with the current balance in Parliament. And also we had someone in Australia, a character called Clive Palmer, who's a billionaire, try and do a sort of Trump parties. He actually called it the trumpet of patriots. Spent, I think, over $60 million. We were all getting texts from them, and there's billboards everywhere, and they completely failed. Like, didn't even get a seat in the Senate or the House of Reps. So really interesting to see how in the Canadian election, the Australian election, how so much of it was around Trump. And there's some pushback around that. There was some local stuff, and there's a lot of sense that, the Conservatives here in Australia didn't run a good campaign. I think that's true. They didn't run a good campaign, and that's even what some of their own people are now saying in the wash-up. But still, the sense that the world is entering into a period of instability because of the trade policies of the US, the military policies of the US. You hear lots of people talking about two things outside of the US, which has been upended the order. One was the meeting with Zelensky in the White House, where leaders and publics all around the world, all of a sudden, who have been aligned to America, began to ask the question, are they still aligned? And then the trade tariffs stuff, has been hugely disruptive. We also had the Singapore election. And while Singapore is, I think it's called sovereign democracy, or some people use that term, it's sort of in some ways a managed democracy. Some people would question whether it's an election. Nevertheless, they had elections, over the weekend. And, the wash-up of that too was, whilst the outcome was predictable, there was still a Trump, and the tariffs were still central to the political discussion there. Interestingly, too, Romania, I think, is also in the electoral process. Again, the US is key and central to that election as well. We just had Friedrich Merz come to power in Germany as the chancellor after a failed initial vote. Again, the discussion is, how does Germany sort of rebuild with the new sort of direction in US foreign policy, and how does Germany sort of lead or have influence on the continent is a huge question. You're seeing the disruptive effect in the world of this. And just one more quickly, we also had in the UK, really interestingly, local elections. So not a general election, but like local council elections and some mayoral elections and a by-election. And traditionally in England, the two biggest parties have been, the Conservatives, or the Tories, as they're also known, and Labor, which is very similar to our Labor Party. And what you saw is that a new party, which is Reform, which is run by Nigel Farage, who was part of the former UKIP party, it's more closer to, the sort of kind of new right-wing party that a Trump is doing, do extremely well. And, possibly move to being the new sort of force in British politics. So traditional conservative parties in Australia and Britain in serious trouble now. from attacks on the left of people moving to more centrist positions or wanting to go further to the right. In Australia, you've seen Australians going, we don't want what's going on overseas. We want to be, and it was very notable in the concession speech and acceptance speech. The Conservative leader, when he conceded in the Australian election, Peter Dutton, was incredibly gracious, quite movingly gracious in congratulating the Prime Minister, talked about his mum who'd passed away, how proud she'd be of the Prime Minister, and even him losing his own seat, congratulated Ali France, who won the seat off him, and she'd lost her son. And it was quite moving. And then when Anthony Albanese, our Prime Minister, got up to accept, there's a bit he said that he'd been contacted by the opposition leader who'd lost, and someone in the crowd yelled out something derogatory towards the opposition leader or booed or something like that. And the Prime Minister scolded that person and said, we're not doing this. We're going to have a culture of respect in Australia. So seeing a real sense in Oz of like, we don't want to do what's happening in other places. But what I found interesting is in all these things, in Australia, you've got a sort of rejection of what you're seeing in some of the more extreme policies in other places. In Canada, there's this turnaround, particularly as the 51st state, and a sense of insecurity. In Australia, it's more like we don't want that. Singapore, talking about how Singapore's as a trading nation is going to be affected. Germany trying to reel and how to set itself. Romania, and we could talk about others. But just really interesting, the volatile nature of what is happening to the US is now spilling out into the rest of the world. And this sense that different in the US, but local politicians all of a sudden realizing they don't have this sort of control over their own economies and nations that they once did. I just had one thing too, is really interesting as well. In the Australian election, one of the real issues being in our country and the sort of climate that we have here was the climate and global warming. And just really interesting too is seeing, you think about that in Australia, which was one of the big issues that people, I saw, I think it was second on the top issues that people were voting around or something like that close to the top. And really interesting, you're seeing China obviously in a great power competition with the US, both of them sort of reneging and moving back on some of their climate initiatives. Trump talking about, mining the seabed, but then really interesting, Tony Blair, he's obviously, the ex-Prime Minister of Britain, but still quite an influential figure in influencing the Labor Party, the party on the left, sort of came out and sort of started saying that, we're not going to get to net zero, that it's going to cause pain on people, pulling back from that. So what that raises is, politics on the left in Australia has been very sort of pro net zero, which I understand. But then you have got this question is, what happens if all these countries in the world pull right back from this? Like the EU's already pulling back on stuff.
Sure.
And then in Australia, we're sort of pushing into this, whereas the reality is a country like Australia with a very small footprint globally, are you going to ask people in Australia to go to net zero and perhaps, go through some difficulty with that? Then when some of the large countries in the rest of the world aren't doing it. So you can see these changes coming. By the way, none of that's a pro or anti necessarily comment around climate. I'm just trying to illustrate that a country can have an environmental policy, a security policy, an economic policy, but the reality is the big boys are the ones setting the agenda now.
It doesn't happen in a vacuum.
No.
Yeah, that's a lot happening. And there's also something else that you've been keeping your eye on as well. India and Pakistan.
Yes.
Rising tensions there.
Yeah.
Even attacks this morning.
Yes. So, we've sort of been texting backwards and forwards. So I think I texted you guys to sort of say, we could have a war sort of breaking out. And literally, as we sort of go to air. Do you go to air on a podcast? Well,
sure,
as we record, India has started some attacks in Pakistan, and Pakistan is retaliating. So it's, it may be at a different stage when you're listening, but that's where we're at. Literally, we're just looking at Twitter and watching some videos before we started recording. But basically, I'm not going to do a whole history of the conflict, but obviously there's a partition after the British Empire where, a lot of the Muslim population, was sort of moved to Pakistan, and then there was West Pakistan, which has become Bangladesh today, and more of the Hindu population. It's not all Hindu, there's, but that's sort of the really rudimentary breakdown. And there've been tensions throughout the years. There's been numerous conflicts. And some of that also has been made a lot more pressing because both have become nuclear powers. So you've got these two countries, one Muslim, where you've had a sort of long questioned role of radical Islamism. Famously Benazir Bhutto, who was, I think she was educated at Oxford, who was sort of seen as a more Western-friendly prime minister, was killed, by Islamists in a car bombing. Obviously, too, you've had, different times where sort of, there's been accusations of sort of Pakistan's connection through its intelligence service, the ISI, to both Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And its influence in Afghanistan. But then also in recent times, you've had the rise of the Modi regime in India, which is much more Hindu nationalist, where India has been a secular country. And when you say secular in India, you don't mean everyone's atheist. It's more that you've got a lot of different religions, and sort of, the Congress Party and sort of the post-British Empire tried to create a sort of system where not one religion was necessarily put above others, but that's sort of been wound back. And you go back to Indira Gandhi and other people like that, we're sort of winding that back to a much more Hindu-focused. And Modi's really pushed into that now to the point where, there's sort of an alliance increasingly with the sort of Trumpian right, and the US and India have grown closer, and that's happened even as we've hit Trump 2.0. And then there's sort of an alliance also between Pakistan and China. And there is sort of some of that's also about Belt and Road Initiative and trade and so on, which we're not going to go into now. So what you have is you have two countries, one aligned to China, one aligned to the US, one is, a sort of Islamic country, one a Hindu country, and both pushing into the sort of nationalist forms of that. Who are now sort of facing each other down. So just what happened 2 weeks ago in Kashmir, which is a disputed territory between the two.
Yes.
India was, different little sort of kingdoms or little princelets or statelets, and Kashmir was a particular family, a royal family ruled that, from my understanding, and then so it's always had this sort of, where does it sort of land? It's sort of half administered from Pakistan, half administered from India, different parts, but sort of both staking claim to that. So it's a disputed territory, and that's always been a generator of then conflict. There's been terrorism there and battles and so on. And there was basically a terrorist attack on a group of Indian, I think there was one Nepalese individual there, and they were killed at a sort of park. And this was sort of the match that lit the fuse. And so, this morning, India has attacked what it's claimed to be a series of terrorist sites. Pakistan has responded. And as we speak, I just saw the latest thing as India today is claiming, there's 80 to 90 dead. We don't know exactly. Both sides are slightly, quite, it's hard to get the truth in between the two.
Yeah.
But it looks like, a number of fighter jets have been shot down. There's artillery, so it's escalating as we speak. And there's been sort of firefights across the border. So an India-Pakistan conflict is going to, again, be extremely disruptive for the world. And yet again, we've looked at, obviously, Ukraine, Russia. We've had numerous wars, like Sudan in Africa, and numerous different coups and instability across the sort of Sahel and, different parts of Africa. You've got the Taiwan Strait, Myanmar. So a world of conflict, we add another one, and not just another one, a big one.
Yeah.
And a big one between two very large nations, a lot of people, and ones which are aligned as part of this broader geopolitical conflict in the world, and who are nuclear.
Yes.
So it's going to be really interesting for the US and China in their great power competition, particularly as the US is trying to pull back to, America first, less of a sort of footprint globally, yet sort of aligned to India. It's interesting with the tariff thing, Apple in response to, the sort of tariffs on China, has just announced a couple of days before all this happened that it's moving iPhone production entirely to India, or a lot of it to India, out of China.
Okay.
So you got Apple who's done that, and then this country's in conflict, so hugely disruptive in the world. That's just that if we stay at this level, but there's always an escalation ladder. And, a good time. One of the things I always just encourage people, often we feel powerless with these things, but, just prayer does matter. And, I always encourage people to pray for peace in these places. But particularly too, similar with, whereas Ukraine and Russia has nuclear weapons, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War. But the West has got nuclear weapons. At different times, Putin was threatening the use of tactical nuclear weapons. There's also the Chernobyl power plant, which has been under attack at different times. But what you have here is this would be like if Ukraine had nuclear weapons. Two nations, both with nuclear weapons, and the rhetoric, if you watch I was jumping onto Indian cable the other day, and if you think American cable news is intense, check out Indian cable news, and the rhetoric is absolutely ferocious and fiery. I mean, literally, people on air, experts coming on both sides, sort of, wanting to burn the other, like basically violent. I think I sent you guys a clip. It's next level. So huge rhetoric, to both religious, ideological, sort of, clashing. This is going to be a huge source of, hopefully, best case scenario is that this de-escalates and people can come in with diplomacy. But again, too, if you've got a world of just competition, not collaboration, stuff like this is much harder to solve.
Yes.
And some of the pushback on international institutions and some of their dysfunctions and perhaps even corruption at times or whatever, totally get that. But also part of the reason that some of those institutions grew up in the wake of World War II was we learnt the lessons that you need people to come in these spaces, and that's perhaps better. And now we're in a nuclear armed world. This stuff really, really matters. And even just also on Flight Tracker before, all of a sudden now flight paths are disrupted.
Yes.
Like if you're flying from Australia to Europe or something like this, or from, Asia to Europe, there's more disruption in the world, particularly as India, maybe it depends how big it gets, but just more disruption. Just one thing I'd add too, and also in a world of migration as well, we saw in London, there was some sort of people around the Pakistani embassy, Indians protesting and stuff like that. You think of a place like London where you've got large Pakistani Indian diaspora. We have a lot of Indian people here in Australia.
Yes.
You get the spillover effects of a conflict like this is disruption even in places which are far from.
Yeah.
I remember being in Copenhagen a little while ago, and Modi, I think, had won re-election, and I walk into the square in Copenhagen, in the main sort of city centre, and there's people from the BJP party celebrating, Indians in Denmark celebrating. So this stuff spreads throughout the world.
Well, I wonder if we move on to your next point, that about agents of disruption.
Yeah, so this is all disruptive, but I just wanted to point to there's sort of events that happen which are disruptive, an earthquake, a war. Humanity's always had that. But, if you were thinking that we had a vibe shift, we had this sort of polarization thing.
Yep.
And then we went into this vibe shift, and now the world swung right and Gen Z swinging right, and that's the way it's going to be. Instead, what we're going to find is greater disruption. And I think part of the reason for that as well is, and I just want to explain this out. So the world as it's reshaping is being shaped by a great power competition between China and America is now the driving story in the world.
Yeah.
The tariff stuff is, yes, it's to get rid of the trade imbalances as Trump sees it, to deal with the national debt as Trump sees it, to bring manufacturing back to the American heartland as Trump sees it, all that stuff. But really, it's also about a great power competition with China, and that Trump feels that they're losing their trade and economic war with China. So this is economic war, really. And, you can build a wall, which was a big part of Trump's 1.0. The wall never got built, but build a wall. But tariffs are economic walls. And so you've got this going on. I thought of this episode when I was reading this week. Kevin Rudd was the Prime Minister of Australia. When he lost office, he went to Oxford. He was part of I think he was the head of the Asia Society or the Asia Institute in New York. But then he went to Oxford and decided to do his dissertation on Xi Jinping. He wanted to understand if Xi Jinping is not elected, His family genes are very good. They live very long time. So Xi Jinping is going to be in charge of one of the biggest countries in the world, China, who is shaping the world for possibly the next 20 years, barring some health episode or he's deposed. He has taken significant power in the world, in the party. He's changed the elements of how the Chinese Communist Party works so that he's solidified his power. The Chinese Communist Party after Mao Zedong, basically set up the party to sort of in the Politburo to resist being under what, Khrushchev called a cult of personality, one leader who dominates. So in a sense, while it's a dictatorship or while it's an authoritarian regime that's non-democratic, they wanted to have a function to avoid being under a dictator like with Mao. So what the whole idea in communist Leninism is that the party runs things, and they were concerned that a dictator was running things versus the party. So they set up systems to stop that. He's undone a lot of that, right? So it's Xi's party now, and Xi's society, therefore. And it's really interesting reading Rudd's. So Rudd wrote a very good book called The Avoidable War. What do you think about Kevin Rudd? He's actually quite a good writer and a clear thinker on China. He's understands China, speaks Mandarin, sort of made his life's work. And Avoidable War is a very good book on Taiwan and China. But this is the biggie, and it's a study of how Xi thinks and Xi's view of economics and so on. But the point I want to bring is, instead of going into Xi's view on economics and Marxism, is this. He states near the beginning of the book that Xi's sort of life goal is to disrupt the global order, which he sees as an American order, to disrupt it and to create a new global order that suits China's interests. Now, okay, so what does this mean? We've got two great powers who are racing ahead in economic war, information war, technological war, quantum computing. There's an AI arms race between China and America. There's a governance race between, on TikTok and X, there are videos now where they'll show you the New York subway and there's rats and it's falling apart and it looks like the 19th century, and they show you the subway in Shenzhen. There's these videos of like Westerners like walking through these Chinese cities and it's amazing. That's an information war, but it's ultimately a war about governance. It's formerly been, the last few years been harder for Westerners to get to China. It's flipped. All of a sudden now, no one wants to go to the US. People are taking burner phones. There's extra security checks and people checking, what they've written online. I've spoken to people who've had extra screening, and there's a lot of people I know cancelling. Tourism to the US is dropping off. Business travel is dropping off. Interestingly, travel to China is picking up. Speaking to somebody who's going to China, and they just booked it. It's so easy to go now. All of that is around information war and a governance war. We're the better group to do the global governance. But what you have, this is my big point, Xi wants to change the global order. That's his goal, to suit China and to suit his vision of Chinese communism. And it's a very new communism, it's market-driven, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
Donald Trump wants to change the global order as we've understood it. We have been shaped by a global order that comes out of World War II, Bretton Woods, international order, international institutions, World Bank, United Nations, IMF. That's shaped the Olympics. That's shaped FIFA. That's shaped all these things. That's just shaped how Hollywood distributes its movies globally. All this stuff, more stuff than you realize, has been shaped by that post-world order. That's one of the big themes of this video. This podcast. You now have the two people with the most agency and power in the world want to upend and rewrite the order that we've been in. Now, some people might be out there going, great, I can't afford a house. My job's fragile. I want that. But the big point I'm making here is the two superpowers are bent now not on maintaining the order, but upending the order. That is one of the most consequential facts of our age. So what this means is we're not now in a new phase. What I'm starting to realize is grey zone is intensifying. I began to wonder when Trump 2.0 came in, okay, is this the new order? What we're seeing in the UK is the Conservative Party, the venerable party of Conservatives, is in real trouble now. In Australia, it was this huge shift to centrism. Germany's struggling, going to have to struggle with the question of how does it lead in Europe with its history in Europe? What is Europe? All these profound questions. So the new normal is volatility. The Silicon Valley thing of move fast and break things is now how global order is being done. China's doing it a bit slower. She has plans. She has been preparing for this trade war for some time, I believe. I remember reading things 6-7 years ago where they're asking people to stockpile food. So what this means is volatility. And I just want to read, I just copied down here the Oxford Dictionary's definition of volatility. Liability to change rapidly and unpredictably, especially for the worse. The succession of new rulers, this is an example, quite a good one
from the dictionary.
From our dictionary, what we're talking about. The succession of new rulers contributed to the volatility of the situation. 2, a tendency of a substance to evaporate at normal temperatures, the volatility of chemicals in an indoor environment. So what that also means, that's really interesting, that evaporate thing. So you could think, so I'm just going to give people an example. I've seen a lot of commentary in the US of, churches have now got to get used to there's a vibe shift. It was a secular world that was progressive world, and now young people became more traditional. This is the new thing. Well, yes, that may be happening, but what happens if, let's look at this. Donald Trump has said, when it comes to tariffs, Donald Trump said there's going to be a period of pain. Bessent's saying this, Lutnick's saying this, people around him saying there's going to be a period of pain, maybe even recession. Donald Trump saying, your kids may have had $37 or whatever it was. Now they'll only have 3, right? Donald Trump, who is arguing the positive for his case for tariffs, is saying you're going to feel pain. There's going to be a period of economic disruption. Things are going to get worse before they get better. That's the positive spin. Yes. The negative spin of many of the economists and trade experts are like, yeah, it's going to get worse and then even worse into a depression. So both sides agree on one thing. America is about to go into a recession and through a period of economic difficulty that's going to affect standards of living. Okay, why did Trump win the electoral and the popular vote? Because large amounts of Americans who weren't super sold on Trumpism or were low information voters or swing voters, as we call them here in Australia, not committed to any party, voted for Trump because they felt the Biden economy was bad and they're better off under Trump 1.0. Trump is saying things are going to get worse economically. Can he keep his electoral coalition together if things get worse? So we could have the vibe shift, but we're going to have another vibe shift in 6 months. Some of the predictions, again, we'll see what happens. We've learned not to predict too much, but the video, if you look at the live cameras of the port of Seattle in Washington State, if you look at Long Beach, LA, other even on the East Coast, they're empty. If you look at ship tracking apps, there's a bunch of container ships sitting doing nothing off Shanghai. That's the world's factories. That stuff ain't coming to America. There's going to be a point very likely where there'll be, shortages on the shelves and a big spike in inflation. So if you think this political order is going in a direction, I'm sorry, you need to be prepared for anything. The vibe shift towards the right could radically change to a vibe shift before the to the left, where AOC gets in 3 years, or there's a Luigi Mangione party. Anything could happen. Am I saying that's going to happen? I don't know. So I'm not making a prediction here. I'm saying it is really hard to predict the volatility of where we are going, and what seems like the new mood, the vibe shift, can evaporate like that in the world. What happens if India and Pakistan go nuclear? God forbid. But the consequential global volatility levers are being pressed like a madman, on the piano.
So you can I glean that one of the things that you are saying, if we're looking at trends and the way things are heading, what you're suggesting is not to pin everything on, this trend looks like it's heading in this direction, so we'll put in XYZ to make this happen. You're saying it's probably not the thing to hang your hat on, but to be prepared for things to be
Here's my big
fluid.
Prediction. My big prediction.
I'm going to hang my hat on this.
And I'm going to hang my hat on this prediction. My big prediction is utter unpredictability.
Yeah. I mean, we're definitely already seeing that is the case.
Yes. But I'm predicting a significant increase.
Well, your final point here
yes,
is that stability and consistency becomes countercultural in volatility.
Yes. So if the world is volatile, what cuts through? Stability. What becomes, if in terms of, scarcity in a sense creates wealth. If there's an item which is very rare, it becomes more expensive. And there's an element where many of these, just as the Australian Prime Minister is in far less control of what they used to be of and has far less ability to control their own destiny, is sort of just having to adapt to bigger forces in the world. In the same way, whether you're thinking about this just as a human being trying to exist or as a leader in the marketplace or your business, your organization, your church, your ministry, wherever, our ability to control these larger forces is increasingly hard, and maybe we had less than we ever thought we did. We are able to intercede and pray, and God is in control of history. There have been periods of extreme volatility before. Listeners know that. But I just want to push in that in times of volatility, stability cuts through more. As you guys know, and maybe some of our audience, we just started a new location and we've renovated an old church that's been there since it was from 1913 was first on that site, which is old for Australia. Probably people in Europe are scoffing.
Yeah.
It's probably someone like, I lead a church that was built in 1100 or something. Australia, that's oldish. And across the road from where we're doing the church, there's a nursing home which is shut down. There's going to be a lot of high development around there, and the government's changed the planning code, and that suburb's going to change a lot. And I was going there to pray the other day on Saturday morning, go to the prayer room there, and I was getting into my car, and this lady came up to me and goes, "Do you know what's happening with this building?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's being redeveloped. Church of Christ are redeveloping it. Blah blah." And she's like, "Is it still going to be a church?" And I said, "It is." And she said, "Oh, I'm so relieved. Everything seems to be falling down at the moment." And I took that as there is an exhaustion. Alvin Toffler talked about a kind of future shock. We're in future shock times 10, where it's like culture shock, but the future keeps coming and there's nothing predictable and it's just constantly happening. Our leaders like Anthony Albanese just won the election in a landslide, but he's going to have to deal with a world where he has very little control over, and a housing crisis, which Moody's did a rating, or S&P, one of the ratings agencies, did a ratings thing on the left and right wing parties in Australia's election promises, and they basically said, "You guys can't afford any of this." So he's going to have to make decisions. Mark Carney's going to have to make decisions. Trump's got to try and make this trade war work. She's got to try and be in an economic war with the US and keep his manufacturing going. Like, it's going to be really hard to lead. But what we can do at a smaller level is that we can be symbols of stability. We live increasingly in a world which we're realizing that we live in a world of relationships. Our connectivity to each other, our connectivity to the world is increasingly apparent. So we live in a world of relationships. And so in a sense, we're in the system. And when you're in the system, you can influence the system by taking a particular posture in the system. When we take a particular posture in the system of stability, predictability, you can influence. And this is where I think there's this, and I've talked about this I think the other week, this is where the long term, there's two, I described this earlier today to some people that almost the way we've wanted influence is we've wanted it fast and quickly. We want to win the lotto, so we've got a massive bank account of influence in a minute. $1 million. You won the lotto, bam, you're a multimillionaire. But actually how influence works is it's almost like just coins being deposited in a piggy bank over a lifetime to the point where one day there's a significant amount in there. And so when you're doing that over time, when you are being stable in your character,
yes,
stable in your ongoing growth and development, stable in your witness, stable in good and bad seasons, that really counts. And one thing I've noticed of late, and I share this not to make myself look good or whatever, but I just perhaps if you're a younger leader, when I was younger, I would do a talk somewhere or I would do a sermon at this place, and particularly when you first start getting asked to speak at places, and you'd really hope that you did well. So people go, that guy was great, let's get him back. And what you're looking for is like, oh, you're the best speaker. That first book was great, blah, blah, blah. As I get older, I notice people will come up and say, thank you, Mark, for doing this for so long. Thank you for being a consistent voice. And again, too, I'm not saying that to, blow my trumpet. But what I wish I'd known that when I was younger.
Yes.
Because it's not about how well you pull off that talk. Maybe it's how kindly you talk to the people after the talk. And maybe it's that those people see you next year and they go, that guy keeps growing, or she keeps developing, and he's gotten more mature, she's gotten more kind. And so I think that we need to think in a way. There are people who listen to this podcast who are in positions of power in a lot of the stuff we've spoken about. That is part of our audience. There are other people who live small-scale lives. Whatever the scale of your influence, your predictability in an unpredictable world, and I'm not saying be predictable and boring and stodgy. I'm not saying that. I'm not even making an argument for tradition here or anything like that. I'm just simply saying that at times of utter unpredictability, a community that build slowly, a community that is present, people who are reliable and dependable. And again, too, that has to be rooted in the incarnational reality of Christ.
Yes.
That Christ came, lived amongst us. That there is this sense that it was in relationships, it was in a particular time and place, it was connected, it was embodied. And I think, I'll perhaps end on this. I'm reading a book called The Monastic World at the moment. It's a history of the monastic movement, and sort of from the 800s or whatever to, it's 400s to, it's about 1,000 years really. You can trace it back to Egypt and Syria, the Middle Ages and so on. And I'm not going to make an argument here. Let's all become monks, right? So I'm not even making an argument for modern monasticism. But what I realized reading that book is, because there's so many different types of monks and nuns, very different emphases, different theological emphases, practices. But what I realized was, as the Roman Empire fell and they went into volatility and unpredictability, guys like, the Egyptian mothers and fathers, the Celtic monks, the Benedict, they created these small worlds of stability. How they prayed, how they worked, how they did business, how they did the fields, how they did mission.
Education.
Yeah. And really medieval society is renewed. The best of medieval society of exact hospitals, universities, learning, the fact that we have these great texts that were not forgotten, the fact that Europe was re-educated is because these people started with these sort of small, scalable ways of living differently.
Yes.
And so almost you have to invent that. I've mentioned my friend Roshan Allpress's book on evangelical entrepreneurs in the 19th century. And the way he sort of talks about in that book is also like in the 19th century, what happened was you had these people like the Clapham sect and Wilberforce and so on who had created ways of being Christian that influenced society, but also went everywhere from like, how do we get Parliament to abolish slavery down to how do I do devotions in my marriage? And how do I have friends over and share things of God with them? Really it was, you had this out of the great awakenings of the 18th century, it was almost like these scalable ways of being Christian, these life worlds of being Christian. I think that's how Roshan lives. It's like a modality. Roshan explains these sort of scalable ways of being Christian. It's like a modality. And you could argue that actually the beginnings of evangelicalism, and I mean it in its best sense of the word there, of the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries or whatever, really was like the monastic movement. It was a way of being a livable modality of what is to be a Christian in a time. So I'm not saying go back and do exactly what the Clapham sect did. I'm not saying go back and be a Celtic monk, but learn from them that at different times the church will discover ways to live. And I think we're at the beginning of a creation process of what that looks like going forward. But it's got to be rooted in stability at a time of volatility. And there's a predictability so that I can guide my way through this, through a God who is unchanging as our way through this. And people are probably like, Mark, but tell me the 6 things. But there are people on here who are working in government, people who are doctors, people who are farmers, people who are just trying to work out how to parent their kids, running a church, doing all kinds of different things, just trying to live their life. So I'm not going to give you 5 things. But what if together in this moment, God is inviting all of us to work on the project, and something will emerge. So if we're all still here, the world's still here, and Jesus hasn't come back in 1,000 years, people will be writing at the beginning of the 21st century, in a world of unpredictability, a new mode of being Christian began to, and it actually not only regenerated the church and helped people live, but actually regenerated the entire society. That's a mega renewal that we need to pray for.
Absolutely. Amen. Any other comments from you, Daniel, before we wind up for the day?
All good. This is super helpful and just an encouragement to the witness that the church should be at a time like this.
It's almost like we need, coming out of the front of the church, a geyser of living water.
And there we are. We've come full circle. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this episode today. If you want any notes and a bit of a background chat on this episode, we record it straight after, and then we send it out a couple of days later. So you can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co and register there. We'll catch you next time.